I didn't hear the chainsaw first. I felt it in my ribs like a distant drum that shouldn't exist on a calm weekday morning. The sun had just scraped over the water, and the lake wore that milky shimmer it gets when the air is cooler than the surface. I stepped onto the deck, a mug in my hand, and the sound sharpened, jagged, purposeful. For a blink, I thought it came from across the cove. Then the whine rose and broke, and the mug rattled against the railing as if to warn me. A tall white pickup idled by my curb, hazard lights blinking, an orange cone planted where our grass met the sidewalk. The crew was already in my yard, helmets down, ropes snaked like veins across the lawn. The oak, throbbed with the saw's bite while the lake breeze carried a faint smell of damp bark and cold iron. I made it halfway down the steps before the first limb dropped. It didn't thud. It crashed with a heavy, tearing finality that sent birds winging from the reeds. My hands opened on instinct, and the mug hit the bottom stair, shattering. An absurd thought flared: there will be porcelain shards between the planks for weeks. The crew moved fast, conferring with hand signals, tossing loops, stepping with practiced indifference around the hostess my partner had coaxed through 2 tough winters. No one looked at me as the saw sang again and bit deeper. 2 weeks earlier, the board had mailed a routine newsletter with pastel hydrangeas on the header. I'd skimmed it, the way you skim the hum of a refrigerator. Trash pickup delayed a day, new kayak rack policy at the beach lot, a reminder that holiday lights must come down by January 10th. The board president, let's call her Ms. B, added a paragraph about community view corridors, a phrase that sounded breezy until it grew teeth. Please ensure vegetation does not obstruct lake views from the public paths, the line read, nestled between boilerplate about shared amenities and a clip art sailboat. I didn't imagine it applied to a tree that was there before the subdivision, a tree that shaded 3 yards, a tree we measured our kids' summers against by the height of the rope swing we used to hang and take down like a ritual. This was not a warning. It was an introduction to an entirely different story, the kind that pretends to be about aesthetics but really isn't. Even as I watched the crew set the next anchor line, I knew we weren't arguing about a twig in the sidewalk. We were stepping into an argument about power, about who decides what beauty looks like and what gets erased to achieve it. The first cut had been made long before the saw, somewhere in a meeting I didn't attend, where my family's tree got refiled from living landmark to non-compliant obstacle. By the second limb, it became a rhythm: whine, crack, drop, scurry. The foreman pointed to the trunk, to a chalk line that circled it like a noose drawn in geometry class. Every loop of rope, every pull on the winch, every nod of the foreman's chin declared a plan already finalized. I wanted to ask who signed the work order. Instead, I looked for the evidence that would prove I wasn't losing my sense of reality. It sat in my memory like a stone: CCR Section 4.3, the View Corridor Rule, the one the board had always ignored because it was meant for shrubs by the shared paths, not old growth on private parcels. That rule would show up again. I didn't know how yet, but it would. I did what people do in moments like this: I reached for a story that could hold the shock. The oak was our calendar, our shade, the source of a rough little bench my father carved from a fallen branch when our son turned 5. We'd celebrated under that crown: graduations, job offers, quiet Wednesdays where the grill hissed and the lake lapped patiently at the stones below the deck. All of that seemed to teeter on a wire as the crew moved in a practice dance. The saw coughed and revved. The trunk shook. I could see the day's ending from the day's beginning, which made it worse. I knew what a stump looks like in the evening light. They didn't ring the bell, and they didn't knock. The letter that explained everything, if it existed, was not in my hands. The only paper I could name was a final notice, mailed to my neighbor 2 doors down last month, a thick, stern envelope with red uppercase ink, dated May 12, threatening fines for something as forgettable as a mailbox paint chip. I'd laughed when she showed it to me, the way you laugh at a mosquito that hasn't landed yet. That notice suddenly felt like part of a pattern. It had numbers, signatures, and the board's seal at the bottom. Precisely the kind of thing someone will point to later and say, "We followed procedure." The smell of cut wood grew sharper as the saw tore through another limb. I'd like to say I yelled to stop and they listened, but there was no arguing with a signed work order and a board that had decided a view around the curve of the public path mattered more than our oak. I didn't recognize the men in helmets, but I recognized the logo on the truck from the last budget meeting. Landscaping was the board's favorite line item. It had grown each year the way my lawn never could. The oak had been listed as healthy in the city's inventory. I had a PDF from last fall, a fact sheet volunteer arborists shared during the fall tree walk, noting its age and canopy spread. I would find that file tonight and put it next to anything the board produced. It wouldn't reattach a limb, but it would name the truth. They didn't remove a hazard, they removed an inconvenience. I stood in my yard and watched a piece of our life become brush. The lake glittered in the corner of my vision like it always does right after sunrise, the reflection broken by the ripples of a gull slicing low. The crew's chatter was ordinary, the exchange of humans doing a job, but it carried undertones of hurry. If they were here early, it meant they wanted the work done before neighbors got curious. Surprise is a tactic. It looks like efficiency, but it feels like theft. Even as the trunk was stripped bare, a part of me cataloged everything. The orange cones. The unannounced arrival. The white pickup with a clipboard tucked on the dash. The chalk ring around the trunk at knee height. The way the foreman kept glancing up at the top of the street, as if waiting for a signal that would tell him whether they'd be thanked or scolded by lunch. I recovered my phone and filmed quietly, not with a roar but with a steadiness born of disbelief. I knew Ms. B would have a version of this day that sounded clean. I needed the version that sounded like the saw. The board did this at dawn for a reason, and they weren't done. By Friday, they expected applause for protecting views. I had 4 days to turn an early morning ambush into a reckoning, and a paper trail that would make "we followed the rules" sound like a punchline. Let me back up before the trunk hit the point of no return. Our association is neat when you look at it from the water, the way a row of teeth looks neat from afar. 25 homes fan around the small crescent of the cove, with a shared path stitched along the shore. The path is why we moved here. People pass with dogs and coffee and laughter that drifts across the rocks like music on a modest stereo. The board's favorite words are harmony and standards. Most days those words mean tidy lawns and mailboxes that match. On other days, they mean something else. The view corridor rule lives in a binder in the clubhouse office: covenants, conditions, and restrictions, page marked with a yellow flag, section 4.3. It states that vegetation shall not materially obstruct lake views from designated public access points along the shore path. It was meant to protect the framed sites the developer promised in glossy brochures. Since the path curves, designated means 3 overlooks that jut like small plazas where the path widens. Our oak isn't anywhere near those. It sits 30 feet into our lot and 70 feet up from the waterline. If you were on the path and craned your neck, you could see the lower branches in your peripheral vision, the way you can see a lamppost when you're not looking for one. I knew this because I'd walked the path for years, measuring sunsets by the step count to the third bench. Ms. B won the presidency 2 terms ago on what sounded like a pragmatic platform: cost control, fresh eyes, a promise to enforce what others ignored. She's efficient with paper and prickly with people. The treasurer, Mr. K, likes to remind us he's a numbers guy, which is true in the way a calculator is honest. The secretary, a cheerful man with an excellent memory for small sins like recycling bins left one day too long, keeps the minutes and sighs into the microphone whenever the crowd gets loud. If you've ever watched a committee perform fairness, you know the rhythm. They ask for comments, set a timer, then use the bell as a shield. It works until it doesn't. We'd had skirmishes. A neighbor's garden partner, a sculpture made of driftwood and rope, was ordered into exile for violating the art clause. The kayak rack saga produced 3 different rack heights and 1 memo titled "Wind Dynamics and Community Safety." The mailbox paint color chart, revised twice, was discussed like a constitutional amendment. Through it all, the board nodded in unison about harmony. They invoked it the way ship captains invoke the stars. You might not agree with an address number font, they'd say, but order keeps resale values buoyant. If you didn't agree, you were invited to join a committee, a clever way of moving your dissent to a room with no cameras. 2 things changed this spring. First, Ms. B pushed a new landscaping contract through in March, adding view management to the scope. The vendor, a company that never bid low, now had permission to evaluate and address view obstructions along the path, including but not limited to trimming and removal consistent with CCR Section 4.3. The contract had a schedule of rates that read like a menu: brush clearing by the hour, stump grinding by the inch, canopy lifts priced like luxury appetizers. I remember the meeting because the projector hiccuped and sprayed the wall with a screensaver of rolling hills while the secretary joked that we were all here for vistas anyway. The second change was quieter. The city updated its urban forestry guidelines, emphasizing preservation of mature canopy. It wasn't a prohibition, it was more like a raised eyebrow from the professionals. Both changes would matter, but not the way the board expected. The oak had a story older than ours. The previous owner had installed a simple bench under it, a rough cross plank over 2 trunk slices, sanded smooth by 100 parties and 1,000 quiet mornings. We inherited the bench like a note from the past that said, "This is where you sit when you need to remember what matters." The roots arced under our lawn, a slow braid that made the turf uneven. In fall, neighbors gathered to guess when the first heavy leaf would drop. A silly tradition, sure, but we wrote the winner's name on a chalkboard by our back door because it felt like a way of belonging to each other. By late April, a neighbor texted that the board was inventorying views. The word inventory sounded neutral until crews with clipboards began pacing the path, peeking into yards like birders who'd been told to count nests for charity. I waved. They nodded. A week later, someone hung laminated signs on the 3 official overlooks with breezy sayings about horizons and community, the way coffee shops put up chalk quotes about gratitude. Pictures landed in the neighborhood group chat: sunsets sliced by silhouettes, a canoe gliding past reeds, and a note from Miss B thanking the landscaping team for protecting what makes our place special. It read like tourism. It sat badly in my throat. 2 days after that came the knock I didn't hear, the door tag left under the doormat while we were at work, with the vendor's logo and a box checked next to scheduled work, residential parcel perimeter. No date, no time, no description of the work. Just a phone number and a scrawl like a signature. It would be easy to read that as warning. It wasn't. It was pretense that the board would later call notice. I slipped the tag into the drawer with batteries and twist ties. It felt flimsy then. Later, it would be heavy. I didn't sleep well the night before the cutting. It wasn't dread, it was the sense that gears were turning somewhere I couldn't see. At dawn, the lake lay still, and the temperature snapped cool like a fresh apple. That was when the crew arrived. By the time I stepped onto the deck, the first rope was already around the trunk, and my place in the story was reduced to spectator. Silence is a tactic too. It lets action speak first and loudest. The trunk began to look naked, map-like, the way a mountain looks once the trees are stripped from the map. I traced the chalk line with my eyes and memorized it, as if that could glue bark back on. The foreman's gestures told me he'd seen this all before: the homeowner helpless, the crew efficient, the morning urgent. People will say later that I should have stood in the way. I thought about it. Then I pictured the board sitting in a room praising themselves for handling a disruptive incident, and I saved my body for a different fight. There's a tendency to imagine these committees as cartoon villains. They aren't. Their power comes from paperwork and patience, from a dozen pages of rules most people promise to read at closing and then never do. Their strength is repetition. They send the same letter until you give in. They file notes in folders until the folder looks like history. When they speak in meetings, they invoke fairness and remind you they're volunteers, which is true and also a shield. They hide behind that shield like kids behind a couch during a thunderstorm, peeking over just enough to announce new finds. I kept cataloging. The path lies roughly east-west, with the central overlook opposite our lot. In summer, the sun slants from the northwest in the evenings, so the oak's shadow stretches long across our lawn and stops short of the path. If there was ever a view blocked, it was a winter sunset when the branches etched a lace against the sky, a picture more beautiful than clear air. I would later draw a sketch with arrows and notes, like a school project about light. Evidence doesn't have a smell, but it should. This smelled like chlorophyll and diesel. When the second major limb fell, our neighbor from the corner, quiet, elderly, the kind who walks with hands behind his back like a professor, paused by the path and watched. He lifted a hand in a small wave that felt like a condolence. A minute later, he moved on, the sound of his shoes scraping the path like sandpaper. He once told me the oak predates the subdivision by at least 70 years. He'd seen a photograph of the lake from the 1950s with 2 trees on our slope like sentinels. One died in a storm in '93, he said. The other, ours, had survived everything since. Until bureaucracy decided it could not survive a view rule reinterpreted for convenience. The crew reached the point where the crown was gone, and the trunk's height made it a liability. They started a notch cut, the kind you make when you want a tree to fall in a particular direction, and anxiety unspooled in my stomach. If they toppled it whole, it would take out the fence, maybe the corner of the deck. The foreman measured twice, then shook his head, and the saw's pitch shifted as they carved the trunk into sections instead. That small mercy didn't let me breathe easier. It only meant I'd watch the tree die in segments. I knew then what my first move would be after the saws left. I would find the board agenda excerpt from the March meeting where the landscaping contract was amended. It would say, View Management, and it would cite CCR Section 4.3. I'd put that next to a City Urban Forestry Bulletin from April that urged preservation of mature canopy. I'd put both next to photos of our path, annotated with sightlines, and point out how the designated overlooks never intersected our oak's canopy. I didn't know yet what that would achieve, but it gave me a rail to hold while the world shook. When the crew paused for water, the yard looked like a stage between scenes. Piles of limbs, coils of rope, the trunk half its former height. I could taste sawdust on my tongue, fine and bitter, and it made me swallow like I'd been talking too long. The lake answered with a soft slap of small waves against the stones, a sound that usually calms me. Not today. Today it sounded like something trying to get in. If you've never lost a tree, you might think grief is too big a word. But loss doesn't ask permission to use the full dictionary. I walked the perimeter of the debris as if it were a crime scene, which, in a way, it was. The stump would be obvious by midday, and the raw circle would look obscene against the green. I took close-ups of the rings where they'd cut, counting the years like a prayer, and my lips moved without sound. 49 by my rough count, and then I found older rings nested like stories inside stories. I put my hand flat against the exposed wood the way people touch a monument for luck. It was warm from the saw's friction. I didn't move for a long breath. Neighbors began to pass on the path, drawn by the sound. It takes about 20 strides to cross the gap in our fence where steps go down to the water. Some slowed and frowned. Some looked away. Most pretended to talk about something else while their eyes kept flicking to the stump in progress. The board thrives on people looking away, their power requires it. But I saw 2 phones raised, 2 different angles, and I knew the footage would sprawl online by noon. That mattered. Not because I wanted a pile on, but because a story told in isolation gets rebutted as a misunderstanding. A story told by many angles becomes a pattern. I opened the drawer with the batteries and pulled the door tag again, the flimsy paper that would become a talisman of how we'd been handled. I took a picture of it on the kitchen counter next to my stack of mail. Then I opened the binder we keep for house things, warranties, paint codes, the original property survey, because I remembered a line in our closing packet about trees of substantial age and community significance. It wasn't law. It was a developer's promise, the kind of language they used to sell not just a house but a dream of living lightly. I found it, a single-page brochure insert with a glossy picture of the cove and a caption about preserving the natural canopy that gives the neighborhood character and value. It would be dismissed as marketing when I brought it up later. But even marketing has a way of returning as a ghost in court of public opinion. The crew adjusted their helmets and went back to work. The saws screamed again, one high-pitched and one lower, like they were harmonizing in a song I wanted to forget. The foreman checked the chalk line again, and I realized the ring wasn't a guess. It marked where they planned to grind the stump down after the trunk was gone, a scar smoothed until it almost looked like nothing had happened. That's how these things work. You reshape the ground and then ask why people are upset when the surface looks clean. I scribbled a list on a yellow legal pad, because writing steadied me. Find CCR Section 4.3 wording. Pull vendor contract addendum from March packet. Print City Forestry Bulletin. Assemble photos from the path. Track down the arborist's fall report. Ask neighbors for their footage. I underlined the last one twice. If this was going to be more than my private sorrow, it needed to be a public record. I looked at the clock. Monday, 8:47 a.m. The board meets Friday. That gave me 4 days to turn scattered facts into a narrative that could survive the board's penchant for euphemism. The foreman signaled, the crew cut shorter rounds, and the trunk descended notch by notch until it was too low to be dangerous. Sawdust blew in a light breeze and glittered briefly in the sun. The smell of sap grew sweet and then cloying, and I stepped back. The last section gave way, and the foreman killed the saw and wiped his brow. He glanced at me then, a flicker of something like apology, which I refused to accept on his behalf. I didn't want his sorry. I wanted answers from the people who hired him. I walked to the path and stood by the middle overlook, the one with the new laminated quote about horizons stapled slightly crooked to the post. From there, you could see the lake stretched like silk, the far shore nudged with pines, the curve of our cove where ducks leave little arrowheads in the early hours. Even now, with the oak stripped to a stump, you could see how foolish the justification looked. The view had always been open. What changed wasn't the scene. It was the board's appetite for control. I tapped the group chat notification that had lit up while I filmed. The thread had a dozen messages already. What happened by your place? Is everyone okay? Did they warn you? And then a few staunch defenders of rules are rules, who always pop up early in these conversations. I typed a measured response with the facts I could confirm. Work ordered by the association under Section 4.3. No direct notice to us beyond a vendor tag with no date. Tree documented healthy last fall by volunteer arborists. I uploaded a photo of the path view pre-cut and a still of the trunk mid-cut. I asked if anyone had the March agenda handy and if someone could pull the city bulletin. 3 neighbors reacted with the hands up emoji that says both solidarity and I'm watching. There was a clock now. Not just the Friday meeting, but the city's 10-day window for reporting improper removals under the canopy preservation bulletin. If I moved fast, I could force the board to explain themselves in front of someone who didn't owe them a political favor. The deadline wasn't theirs. It was mine. I took one last slow pass of the yard as the crew raked and gathered brush into sad, orderly piles. The oak was a stump with a halo of rings, a perfect circle that made the world look like it had a hole. The bench my father carved leaned against the fence, suddenly unmoored, as if it had lost its reason for pointing in that direction. I touched the bench's rough edge and felt a splinter bite my finger. It didn't hurt much. It stung exactly enough to keep me alert. I would spend the rest of the morning assembling the first bundle of facts. Not rage. Not pleas. Facts. There would be time for sentiment later, but first there needed to be a spine the story could stand on. The association spoke in documents, and I would answer in the same language, and then teach that language to my neighbors, one screenshot at a time. This wasn't just my tree anymore. It was a test of whether a committee could bulldoze quiet people with paper. I headed inside to the dining table we use as a war room when taxes roll around. I opened the laptop, exhaled, and began. First, the CCR. I flipped through the scanned PDF and found Section 4.3 on page 17. The phrasing was careful, like it always is. Vegetation shall be maintained by owners and the association to preserve designated view corridors from the public path overlooks, as marked on Exhibit C. That last part would be important. Exhibit C was a little map with 3 shaded circles on the path. Not one circle overlapped our lot line. I screenshotted and highlighted. Next, the March board agenda excerpt, the one where landscaping got its view management teeth. The packet lived on the association website in the members section, which required an account and a patience for passwords. I had both. The excerpt showed a motion to approve, expanded scope to include removal of obstructive vegetation per CCR Section 4.3, moved by Ms. B, seconded by the treasurer, passed 3-2. I noted the dissenters. I made a grid in my notes to track who voted for what. Paper trails are stories too. I pulled the city's Urban Forestry Preservation Bulletin from April and underlined the part that urged preservation of mature canopy and encouraged homeowners associations to consult with the city arborist prior to removals of trees exceeding a specific trunk diameter. Our oak's trunk at breast height was well over the threshold. The bulletin wasn't law, but it carried authority. If the board skipped consultation, their insistence on procedure would suddenly look like a selective hobby. Then the final notice dated May 12 from my neighbor's mailbox saga went into the pile, not because her paint chip mattered to my oak, but because the board would later claim they always provide adequate notice. The notice's tone, the stamps, the timing, those would help define a pattern of how the board announces what it wants and punishes what it doesn't. I made a folder on my desktop named View Rule, Oak. I dragged files in, the CCR screenshot, the agenda excerpt, the bulletin PDF, photographs labeled with dates and vantage points. I added a text file I titled Timeline, because the story needed a backbone. Monday 7:08 a.m., crew arrival. 7:20, first major limb. 8:12, foreman checks chalk ring. 8:47, stump leveling begins. 9:15, crew departs. When I closed my eyes, I still saw the sawdust drifting in the sun. I walked back outside to watch the white pickup roll away, the hazard lights finally dark. The path was quiet again, the kind of quiet that arrives after a shouted argument, awkward and heavy. I stood at the fence gap and looked at the water. It had the same glitter it always does by mid-morning, when the wind nudges it into small, entirely manageable waves. The dock rope creaked once, a soft complaint I'd heard 1,000 times. Today it sounded like a witness clearing its throat. For days to Friday. For days to turn a stump into a movement. For days to see whether our tidy little cove would accept a pretty phrase like view corridor as an excuse to dismember a living thing that gave us shade, memory, and meaning. This wasn't just about a rule. It was about whether we'd let people who say harmony the loudest decide which lives don't count. I took a breath and set my watch. The board thought they'd won by acting early. They'd merely picked the time. I'd pick the frame. This would not be a rant. It would be a case. And if I could make that case well enough that my neighbors could repeat it even if their voices shook, then maybe Friday wouldn't be a meeting at all. Maybe it would be a mirror. And yes, for anyone keeping score, this is now a different kind of story, the kind of HOA revenge story that doesn't look like fireworks but feels like gravity doing its work. They unmade something in my yard. I'm going to unmake something in their room, the assumption that power can act without consequence. By late morning, the stump cooled to a dull, stubborn circle, and the silence around it made the rest of the yard feel louder. The dock rope ticked against the cleat. A dragonfly hovered at knee height, its wings a fast whisper. I stood there long enough for the sun to shift and paint the fresh-cut surface a pale gold, like a wound trying to pass for jewelry. That's when the first notification from the management company landed in my inbox. It wore the calm tone of templates, a summary of routine vegetation management performed by the association to protect shared amenities, with a line about appreciation for homeowner understanding. There was a PDF attachment stamped with a digital watermark, work authorization, bearing the board signature block. It cited CCR Section 4.3 and referenced Exhibit C, the map I'd already pulled. It also mentioned field assessment from the landscaper indicating material obstruction. That phrase would matter. Material obstruction is a threshold, not a feeling. The path's overlooks were clear in every photo I had taken before sunrise. I opened a document and began lining up images and text like pieces on a chessboard. The work authorization used a pre-checked box to claim notice via door tag. It mentioned a date but not a time. The date, conveniently, matched Monday. The tag we received had no date written. I took a side-by-side photo of the bare checkbox on my tag and the filled checkbox in their PDF. Small details become levers when the big facts are ugly. I added a caption that read like a courtroom whisper, document states date-specific notice, door tag shows no date. I sent a careful email to the city's urban forestry office, attaching the Urban Forestry Preservation Bulletin and asking for guidance. I included the trunk diameter measured at chest height using a cloth tape and a ruler, with a photograph for scale. I referenced the bulletin's encouragement to consult for removals over a given width. I was not filing a complaint, not yet. I was requesting information with a politeness that forced the recipient to recognize I was not a hothead. When people in offices face a tidy, pointed question, they have to pick between answering and admitting they will not. Both choices are useful. Neighbors trickled by the path in the early afternoon, lingering longer than their dogs preferred. They shared what they'd seen, which I translated from sympathy into usable notes. The corner neighbor had a time-stamped photo at 7:06 a.m. The couple from the other side had a text from the management company sent at 9:14 a.m. mentioning emergency hazard mitigation, a phrase so elastic you could park a boat in it. I saved each detail to the timeline file and drew arrows connecting the moments. When a story is this lopsided, the only way to make it stand without shouting is to stitch the quiet facts into one loud fabric. Section 3 was supposed to be the slow build of conflict, the kind you can still laugh through on Tuesday. The board didn't allow the luxury. At 12:40, the treasurer posted on the member portal a note about robust view protection, as if he were a ranger in a national park. He wrote about balance and policies, about how each of us accepts community standards for the privilege of shared beauty. He mentioned the word harmony 3 times in 4 paragraphs. There was a line about misinformation on social media, which told me they were watching the neighborhood chat and beginning to circle their wagons. The attached image was a drone shot of the path, taken, I later learned, over the weekend, showing the 3 official overlooks gleaming like pearls on a chain. The oak was invisible in the frame because the camera faced the water. I dragged the image into my folder anyway, labeled it, and made a note, they will sell a picture that excludes the problem. At 1:10, a neighbor DM'd me a scan of the board agenda excerpt from March with a scribble in the margin, it passed 3-2. The dissenters' names lined up with the people who never smiled when Ms. B spoke too long. That mattered because people tend to accept the inevitability of a unanimous vote. A split vote means there was a choice, and the majority chose haste over consultation. I highlighted the motion text and pasted it under a screenshot of Exhibit C, then placed a photo from the overlook that framed the water through the gap where the oak had never intruded. You could see the absence like a missing tooth in the lower right, but you could also see the lake, unchanged. I added a caption that didn't insult anyone's intelligence, overlooks unchanged, removal changed everything else. By mid-afternoon, the wind freshened off the lake and pushed a leaf scent across the yard that didn't belong in summer, sweet and wet, like fall rehearsing. I took the bench my father had carved and moved it beside the stump. It made a quiet little altar, a place where grief could sit without being asked to perform. Then I saw a new envelope poking from the mailbox, one with the management company's return address. Inside was a courtesy violation notice for tree debris visible from path, with a deadline to remove by end of day Wednesday. It was dated that morning, as if the crew's cutting had generated an instant infraction for the mess they created. I laughed once, a sound with no humor, then I took a photo of the notice and slid it into the evidence stack. If the board insisted on writing their own satire, I would preserve it intact. I wrote a short, dry memo addressed to the board for Friday's meeting, not as a rant but as a formal request for answers. I listed 8 questions, numbered, each with a narrow focus: location of Exhibit C overlays, field assessment documentation showing a material obstruction, evidence of direct notice with time, confirmation of city arborist consultation, and justification for the immediate debris notice. I copied the management company and requested that the questions be included in the packet. When committees receive precise questions in writing, they either prepare real answers or they perform. Performance can be documented too. By early evening, the small disputes had ripened into a pattern the board could no longer pretend was a singular misunderstanding. The lake chopped in small diamonds under a crosswind, and the sound of tiny waves on stone played a steady rhythm behind the tapping of my keyboard. I compiled a 1-page community brief summarizing what had happened, what the rules actually say, and what Friday's agenda would allow. I stuck to facts and dates, I used short sentences and left the adjectives out. I attached 3 images, Exhibit C with the overlooks marked, a pre-cut photo from the path, the stump with a measuring tape across it. I ended with a sentence inviting neighbors to speak during the comment period. Then I sent it to the group chat, blind copied the 2 dissenting board members, and printed 10 copies for doorsteps. Section 3 had one more beat to play before we crossed into escalation. The management company sent a mass email at 6:05 p.m. explaining that a handful of removals had occurred as part of review management and reassuring us that the vendor was ISA certified and compliant. It mentioned a city permit number in a parenthetical. The numbers in parentheticals are the ones that unravel things. I wrote it down and checked the city's online permit lookup. Nothing came up under that number for our block. Either the permit was for something else, or someone had typed the wrong sequence in their rush. I took a screenshot of the empty search and added it to the file. If this was going to be a Karen neighbor drama for anyone watching from the sidelines, it was going to be the version where the details cut sharper than any rant. Escalation began Tuesday morning with a fat upload. Invoice number 1187, dated Monday 9:56 a.m., appeared in the board's document portal for transparency. It itemized the removal of 2 obstructive trees, stump grinding, and debris haul, with line items priced like a small wedding. The invoice named our lot and a parcel 2 doors down. It included a note, owner present, property access unobstructed. That note was technically true in the way a locked door is technically a door. No one asked, and no one was invited. I printed the invoice and circled the timestamp. Then I set it next to a screenshot of my neighbor's 7:06 a.m. photo of arrival. The timing suggested work began before authorization finalized. Patterns become unbeautiful when you put them side by side. By mid-morning, the treasurer posted again, now with a brighter tone as if they could manage optics by insisting on them. He wrote about property values, resale potential, and the necessity of protecting vistas if we expected to compete with neighboring communities. He hinted at unfunded liabilities if the board had to hire legal counsel to defend reasonable enforcement. That was the first whiff of what they thought would make us flinch: money. The subtext was threat braided with virtue. I added this to a new document titled Board Statements, Financial Framing, and highlighted the words that might turn neighbors' stomachs when read aloud in a room. By noon, a neighbor who works in environmental compliance messaged to say the city arborist had replied to my inquiry. The response asked for details and clarified that while the bulletin wasn't law, the city strongly encourages consultation for removals of mature canopy and expects HOAs to lead in preservation. The email included a case intake number. I will remember the way people remember combinations, CAF 22197. I filed it under External Eyes. At 1:30, the wind carried a smell of rain from somewhere upriver, and the light flattened to a soft gray that made the lake look brushed with graphite. I used the mood of the sky as a metronome and assembled what I called the Friday packet. It contained the community brief, the timeline, the screenshots, the invoice, the Exhibit C map, and the city's email acknowledging intake. I printed 15 sets, hole-punched them, and slid them into inexpensive folders with a label. Organization is a weapon when the other side assumes your pain makes you sloppy. Around 2000 hours on our story clock, the treasurer floated a warning in the portal about potential special assessments if unnecessary legal challenges drained reserves. Money at risk. The phrase rolled through the neighborhood like a cold gust, and I knew exactly what to do with it. I drafted a single-page fact sheet titled Reserves versus Reality, using last year's budget to show landscaping's inflation and legal's fat zero. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to hold their own numbers up to the light and let neighbors see the bill the board wanted us to fear. Late in the afternoon, petitions began to hum in back channels. Our bylaws, Section 3.7, allow a recall election if 20% of owners sign a petition stating grounds. I pulled the exact language and formatted a recall petition, Attachment A, with precise wording: removal of Ms. B and the treasurer for cause, specifically misuse of Section 4.3 without adequate notice, failure to consult the city as encouraged, and fiscal imprudence in contracting. I left a line for printed name, signature, unit address, and date. I printed 20 and tucked them in a folder with a small binder clip that looked laughably gentle for what it held. Neighbors started walking over instead of texting. They stood in the grass, looked at the stump, looked at the bench, and exhaled the way people do in hospital corridors. I told them what I knew and what I didn't. I let the papers sit visible on the table like anchors. The birds carried on their skittery calls in the reeds, and an occasional fish flicked near the surface with a hollow plop. Those small sounds kept the temperature down while we planned. The board's escalation wasn't just in words. Wednesday morning, a maintenance staffer laid fresh gravel at the main overlook and installed a new sign with an arrow and the word Vista, as if we lived in a park. The gesture was almost comical for its timing. I photographed it from 3 angles and filed it under Optics. Then the management company emailed a reminder, Friday meeting decorum, a piece of preemptive scolding disguised as civility. It warned that speakers would be limited to 2 minutes and that personal attacks would not be allowed. I smiled and marked my stopwatch. 2 minutes is longer than a person wielding facts needs. By midday, the city arborist called and asked if I would provide a statement about the oak's condition and any documentation. I offered the volunteer arborist's fall notes, which mentioned healthy canopy, no significant disease, minimal dieback. The city rep explained they could issue guidance, not penalties, but they could attend meetings when HOAs seemed to misunderstand their own reach. It was a careful promise in bureaucratic language. It sounded like a door opening quietly. In 4 days, the board rushed a removal under a rule that never touched our lot, dressed it in harmony, and tried to frighten us with money. We dug up the map, the invoice, the permit absence, and the city's raised eyebrow, and stitched them into a packet anyone could hold. Escalation has a way of shaking loose unexpected allies. The 2 dissenting board members messaged that they were concerned and would welcome clarity. Those phrases are code for we see where this is headed. I didn't need them to become heroes. I needed them to follow the rhythm of the paperwork now that it had a beat the room could hear. Section 5 started to breathe on Thursday as retaliation shifted from bearing witness to building pressure. I filed an open records request with the city for any permits, correspondence, or inspections connected to our association's recent tree removals, framing it as a time-limited request to keep it narrow and fast. I submitted the City Arborist Intake Form CAF 22197 with photos and a measured statement about process, not outrage. I lined up neighbors to speak Friday in a sequence that would tell a story: the volunteer arborist on health, the corner neighbor on timing, the environmental compliance neighbor on the bulletin's intent, and a retired teacher on community memory. I would anchor the sequence with 2 minutes that walked Exhibit C to the stump and back without letting the board wander into euphemism. Each speaker received a 1-page brief with 3 bullet points and a copy of the Friday packet. I also printed the recall petition, attachment A, and created a simple checklist to verify signatures met the bylaws: owner of record, unit number, date, legible information. Precision here would prevent the board from throwing out signatures on technicalities. We planned a low-key walkthrough Thursday evening, neighbors knocking on doors with a small pitch framed as a question, not an accusation. Do you approve of how Section 4.3 was used? The petition itself asked for a vote, not a verdict, which meant even those who weren't ready to condemn could sign in favor of letting the community decide. Retaliation in HOA land rarely looks like cinematic fireworks. It looks like a clipboard and a steady pen. I sent one more email, this time to the management company, requesting a slot on the agenda under New Business for Exhibit C clarification. I cited the same paragraph Ms. B always cited when she wanted to expand her scope. The request forced them to either allow the item or deny it in writing, both outcomes useful. The lake breathed a slow hush against the stones as clouds thinned, and the afternoon sun returned with a metallic sheen that made the water blink. Before 30 minutes on our clock, here's the tease that kept me moving: if Friday's room filled with folders and facts, the board's reputations wouldn't be threatened by lawsuits first, they'd be dented by silence from their allies and stares from their friends. Social shame is a quiet hammer. When it swings in a clubhouse, careers on small committees develop hairline fractures. Neighbors began to arrive after dinner for the petition walk. We fanned out with sensible shoes and dry humor. At one door, a man who never attends meetings signed and said he doesn't like drama but doesn't like being treated like furniture either. At another, a widow held the clipboard like it was a candle and thanked us for putting the stump in words because she didn't have any left. We collected signatures without urgency in our voices, which turns out to be contagious. By 9, we had more than the 20% threshold. We didn't celebrate loudly. We stacked the pages privately and checked them twice like an accountant. As the sky darkened, the cicadas started their electric chorus in the trees that remained, and the lake reflected a stray porch light into a shaky ribbon. Back at my dining table, I laid out the petition stack, clipped and labeled, then assembled the speaking order for Friday with names and notes. On top, I set a single page titled Exhibit C vs. Reality with 2 pictures and 3 arrows. It wasn't art. It was legible, which is a different kind of beauty. Thursday ended without fireworks, just the soft friction of paper against paper as I slid folders into a box. The stump outside looked almost peaceful in the dusk, a neat circle that pretended to be gentle. I knew better now. A neat circle can be a bullseye. And in the morning, we would take aim the way small, tired people do when they've run out of patience but not out of love. Friday arrived with a sky as clear as glass, and the lake clicked softly against the stones like a metronome keeping time. The clubhouse parking lot filled in a slow, steady stream, and people carried in lawn chairs as if they were settling in for a long match. I arrived early with a banker's box, the folders stacked like layers in a spine. The air inside the meeting room felt chilled past comfort, the way some offices like to set the tone before a word is spoken. I took a seat by the aisle and set the folders on the chair beside me, visible but not theatrical. The secretary arranged his laptop at the far end of the folding table, the treasurer sorted papers with an energy that read as busy, and Miss B sat in the center, shoulders square, the posture of someone who believes posture can substitute for trust. The agenda was printed and placed in a neat stack by the door. I picked one up and scanned for my request. There it was under New Business, Exhibit C Clarification, Member Request. They had included it, which meant they wanted to demonstrate openness by controlling it. That would be fine. 2 minutes of clarity could puncture 20 minutes of euphemism. Neighbors slid into rows with a low murmur that matched the air conditioning's hum. A few avoided eye contact, a few squeezed my arm in passing. I counted the folders I'd brought, counted the people I knew would speak, and revised the sequence in my head in case the room's mood shifted. The city arborist, to my surprise, sat along the wall with a plain notebook. The only cue was a small badge clipped to her tote. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. The legal consequence hovered like a weather front. If tonight exposed misuse of authority, the city's guidance and our recall petition wouldn't just sting reputations, they could trigger official letters that committees file and keep forever. That kind of paper doesn't go away when you resign. Miss B opened with a welcome and a reminder about civility and time limits, her voice even, the practiced cadence of someone who has chaired 100 meetings and expects to chair 100 more. She ran through minutes and motions in a brisk rhythm, then nodded toward the public comment portion as if she were offering a courtesy rather than fulfilling a requirement. Hands rose. The treasurer started the timer. We were rolling. The volunteer arborist went first, a calm explanation of canopy health, past inspections, and what material obstruction means to professionals who measure sightlines with tools rather than preferences. The room listened in the way rooms do when facts arrive with edges that don't cut skin but leave marks. The corner neighbor spoke next, methodical, arrival time, the first cut, the chronology that didn't match the invoice timestamp. The environmental compliance neighbor followed with the city's Urban Forestry Preservation Bulletin, reading the sentence about consultation like a level laid on a shelf. Silence followed each speaker, not empty, not hostile, just the quiet of people adjusting their understanding. When it was my turn, I stood without ceremony and carried a single folder to the podium. I placed 2 images side by side on the document camera, Exhibit C with 3 shaded circles on the path, and a photograph from the middle overlook taken 2 weeks ago that showed open water framed by shoreline. I walked the room through the locations with language that didn't ask for favors. Then I placed the management company's work authorization on the stack and pointed to the phrase material obstruction, reminding the room what thresholds are. Finally, I put the door tag on the screen with the empty date box next to the PDF's checked box and said what the images already said. The board's story about notice did not match the paper in my hand. I finished by noting that the invoice timestamp trailed the first cut by hours and that the city had opened intake under case CAF 22197 to provide guidance. I didn't point to the city arborist, I let the number sit in the air. The lake wind rapped once against the clubhouse window, a hollow sound like a knuckle on a door. The treasurer leaned into his mic and offered a polished defense. Vistas matter, property values matter, consistency matters, and the board had acted in good faith under CCR Section 4.3. He spoke the phrase harmony twice and floated special assessment like a trial balloon if challenges required counsel. The room's temperature didn't change, but the expressions did, small stiffening around mouths, a few eyes flicking to the folders on their laps. Then the dissenting board member asked, carefully, if the city had been contacted prior to removals, given the bulletin's guidance regarding mature canopy. The management company rep, summoned by a glance from Ms. B, recited a sequence of door tags and portal posts. The city arborist, still leaning against the wall, raised a hand halfway and, when recognized, introduced herself simply and thanked the board for the chance to offer general guidance. She explained the bulletin's encouragement for consultation and the city's interest in mature canopy as a public good. No scolding, no drama, just a line drawn faintly on a map that our association now sat on the wrong side of. She added, with a professionalism that made the words carry, that Exhibit C's designation should be read narrowly. The water moved on the far side of the glass like a sigh. What came next wasn't a confession. It was a pivot. Ms. B acknowledged that communication could have been clearer and that process improvements could help. She suggested forming a task force to review view management and bring recommendations next month. It sounded reasonable in the way a bandage sounds reasonable after a careless cut. The room didn't soften. I stepped back to my seat and let the sequence continue. A retired teacher described the oak's role in neighborhood life, not in tears, not in poetry, just in the plain rhythm of summers and shade. The petition wasn't mentioned during comments. It didn't need to be. Its weight sat in my bag and in the hands of two neighbors who had copies under their chairs. The climax didn't burst, it clicked into place. The secretary announced new business. I returned to the podium for the Exhibit C clarification, this time with a short handout titled Exhibit C versus Reality and 3 arrows connecting map circles to real vantage points. I requested, as a motion from the floor, that the board adopt an interim moratorium on removals under Section 4.3 pending consultation with the city and a vote of the membership to ratify any expanded scope of view management. I cited CCR Section 1.9 regarding member votes for changes that materially affect use and enjoyment. I used the board's own structure as a lever and asked for something that sounded procedural because it was. For a second, no one moved. Then the dissenting board member seconded. The treasurer frowned in micro, and Ms. B composed her face into neutrality. The secretary, following process more faithfully than perhaps anyone expected, called for discussion. 3 hands rose, neighbors who weren't in our planning group, each asking variations on the same question: why rush, why not consult, why not vote? When the vote came, the room held its breath in a way you could hear, the air vents humming like distant surf. The motion passed 3-2. The moratorium was now policy. You could feel it, shoulders lowering, a collective exhale, the sense that we'd found the exact seam in the rulebook and pulled. Just before the gavel moved on, I submitted for the record the Friday packet, the invoice, the map screenshots, and the Urban Forestry Preservation Bulletin. Paper met paper, and the room understood. I didn't stop there because momentum is a tide, and tides crest. During open items, a neighbor asked whether the board would consider adding a standing requirement to consult the city arborist for any removal of mature canopy. The city rep nodded that her office would welcome it. Ms. B, weighing the optics, agreed to place it on next month's agenda. It sounded like concession. It was self-preservation. That was fine. The result would be the same: fewer chainsaws, more conversation. Then came the petition, not as a threat, not as a wave from the back, but as a quiet submission to the secretary in a manila envelope labeled Recall Petition, Attachment A. The secretary, constrained by bylaws, announced its receipt and the triggering of the process: verification within 7 days, special meeting scheduled within 30, vote by secret ballot, majority required for removal. The words were dry, the way legal rain is dry. But in their dryness lived a promise: the community would decide, not just a table at the front. Ms. B nodded, her expression a practiced calm, but her fingers pinched a paperclip in a way that told me she felt the shift. Outside, the light had turned the lake a soft pewter, and a sudden gust rattled the clubhouse door. The board moved to close the meeting with announcements about the summer barbecue and path repairs, the usual community glue. People lingered, the way they do when something real has happened and they want to confirm it with their own words. The city arborist shook 3 hands and slipped out quietly. The treasurer packed his files with a speed that suggested he wanted to be anywhere else. The dissenters looked relieved, not triumphant, not smug, relieved in the way people look when a train finally arrives at the stop they argued for. I stepped into the parking lot with my box and paused by the curb. The air smelled like clean water and cut grass, the regular perfume of Friday nights around the lake. A neighbor walked up and thanked me, then someone else asked if we needed more copies for the special meeting. I answered questions about process and reminded people to keep their statements tight and the tone steady. No one needed me to rouse them. The stump had already done that. That night, I returned the bench to its place by the stump and sat. The rings looked darker in the dusk, like a fingerprint pressed into the earth. The moratorium meant no more surprises in the morning. The petition meant the room would be asked to write its own ending. The city's presence meant that what happened here would not be gaslit into rumor. The sound of small waves came and went, a hush, a hush, a hush that steadied my breath. I realized then that the story had shifted from me and my yard to us and our standards. If the association believed its power rested on protecting beauty, it would now have to prove that beauty didn't mean erasing the living things that made this place worth protecting. That realization was its own kind of justice. Aftermath doesn't arrive with confetti, it arrives with tasks. Over the next week, the management company posted a notice about the moratorium and a link to the city's bulletin. Neighbors traded recipes in the chat again alongside questions about stump grinding and replanting credits. I filed a replanting request with the city and the association, proposing a native oak sapling in the side yard and a shade-tolerant understory by the waterline. Our environmental compliance neighbor offered to help with a simple planting plan that met shoreline guidelines. The treasurer posted one more note about fiscal prudence, then went quiet. I stopped counting small wins and started noticing small repairs. A kid on a scooter paused by the fence gap and asked about the bench with a curiosity that didn't hurt to hear. The widow who had signed slowly passed our yard and nodded at the stump like one acknowledges a grave without needing to speak. The corner neighbor measured the afternoon shadow and reported that, even now, the path's view held as it always had. The city arborist emailed a 1-page guidance note recommending consultation before any future removals and praising the community's engagement. The note felt like closure without drama. 2 weeks later, the special meeting filled the clubhouse beyond fire code. The ballots were counted by volunteers who had not posted opinions online. The result removed Ms. B and the treasurer by a margin that felt decisive without being cruel. They packed their files and left with the dignity you afford people who served, even if you didn't like how. The new interim president, one of the dissenters, opened his remarks with a promise to read Exhibit C as written and to speak to the city before contracting chainsaws. He didn't say harmony. He didn't need to. I stood by the stump that evening with my partner and traced the rings with a fingertip, a quiet thank you to a tree that had done more after its death than any rule had done in years. The lake breathed its old rhythm against the stones, and the sky threw a small, pearly pink against the far shore. The bench felt sturdy, as if its purpose had not been lost but remapped. This was not a sudden victory. It was an ordinary correction, the kind communities must learn to make without fireworks. Tell me your HOA cuts down beloved oak tree moment in one line.